Same kind of questions, but with fractions. Now, some of the fractions, we can make our life easier. Because you know in equations that what you do to one side, you do to the other side. So if you have a fraction, especially, I would say, if you have a number in front of the x squared, like I have a half in front of there, that's going to make my completing the square more difficult because it's not an easy thing to think about. Get rid of it. I don't want that half there. What would I mathematically have to do to get rid of that half? Just so that it would be a 1. Okay? That's what we have to think about. What mathematically could we do to get rid of that half? The opposite would be timesing by 2. Okay? Now, that means if I want to times this one by 2, I have to times this whole side by 2 and this whole side by 2. I will tell you one of the sides is easier to multiply than the other. Do we do the easy side first? 0 times 2. Good. This side, if you multiply this side by 2, everything gets multiplied by 2. Like this 2 will multiply this one, and this one. And the nice thing is now this 1/2 just becomes x squared. The 3x would become 6x. And the negative 9 over 2 would become negative 9. The 6x is my hint. I'm going to move the 9 over to the other side to leave a space for me to complete the square. Now, you might be noticing that when I'm doing my work here, I actually do this next, right? And I say, oh, if it's x plus 6x, what would have to be in there? Plus 3, right? The hint, that always has to be half. And then we can go from there and back to that space. Because if I multiply this out and I'm thinking, what would be my last one? X plus 3 times x plus 3, it's pretty obvious this needs to be a plus 9. And if I add, oh, just like before, we enjoyed adding plus 9 before. We get to add plus 9 there, we have to add plus 9 over here as well. This side then becomes 18. And now we have something squared equals a number, so we can get rid of the square. Square root both sides. Remember your plus or minus. Subtract 3 on both sides. Do I have to simplify the square root of 18, or is it already simplified? Yes. It's part of which family? Root. It's part of our root 2 family. And there is our final answer for the first one. Oh, the textbook would have lost a half mark. All right, part B. Negative 5x squared minus 10x plus 2 equals 0. Again, I don't like that number in front of the x squared. So for completing the square, I'm going to think about how do I get rid of that? Right? The other one I had to multiply. This one, to get rid of a negative 5, you would have to divide by negative 5. Does that make sense? Now, when I put brackets here, and I put brackets here, dividing by negative 5 is the same as multiplying by 1 over negative 5. And if you think in fractions, your math is going to be easy. So this side, I do have to multiply everything by negative 1 over 5. When I multiply this first one, I'm just going to, the whole purpose was get just x squared. When I multiply negative 1/5 times minus 10, you see that you would get a positive, and dividing by 5 would give you 2. Multiplying by 1/5 give you 2. I like the negative. Oops. I like the multiplying here because, wow, switching colors is crazy. This is like 2 over 1. So when I multiply by 1 over negative 5, you multiply your tops, so you would get 2 on the top, you multiply your bottoms, you have 5 on the bottom. It will be negative because it was a negative times a positive. And then on this side, we have to multiply this also by 1 over negative 5. And that's still 0. Question?
How do you get 1 over negative 5?
Because I saw this negative 5 in the front, and I thought if I wanted to get rid of that, the opposite of multiplying by negative 5 would be dividing by negative 5. Mm-hmm. And dividing by negative 5 is the same as multiplying by 1 over negative 5. Because it's like that negative 5 is on the bottom. It's kind of like dividing, but I change it to multiplying because multiplying by a fraction will make your math easier to work with rather than thinking in dividing. Okay? So now I'm going to x squared plus 2x, move the 2/5 over, leave this space for my last ones, and I'm going to use my hint. My hint is the 2. What would have to be in here? Plus 1. And then if I squared this in my last term here, 1 times 1, I need a plus 1 in order for this to equal this. And if I add 1 to this side, I add 1 to this side. How do you add fractions? You need a common denominator. So my common denominator by 1 would be 5 over 5, 2 over 5, plus 5 over 5, 7 over 5. Okay? I think textbook's going to lose a whole mark on simplifying on this one, but we'll do it right. Okay? Now we have something squared. We can square root both sides. So leave me with x plus 1 plus or minus 7/5. And then to get x by itself, you subtract 1 on both sides. And I'm going to guess this is where the textbook stopped. Yes. Okay, they would lose 2 half marks for this, because technically this is not simplified, because square root of 7 over 5 is the square root of 7 over the square root of 5. And we learned in our previous unit, you cannot leave an answer with a square root on the bottom. It's not simplified. So we have to get rid of the square root on the bottom. Do we remember what we called that? Rationalizing the bottom. What's the bottom called? The denominator. So we need to multiply this by square root of 5 and this by square root of 5. And we would get x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 35 over 5. And the last simplification thing that you've probably never heard of before, but is a rule for simplification, is that if you have fractions, you should write your final answer as one fraction. And right now, this is a number plus a fraction, so we should combine these by getting a common denominator. Can you see that 1 would be 5 over 5? And so the proper way to write this answer would be negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 35 all over 5. And then you also have to check that square root of 35 can't be simplified, but it can't, so that part is done. So we really have to know a lot of mental math strategies once we start simplifying things. Your times table comes back over and over and over again. Okay, questions for this one? Just circle 10 and 11. But we'll do the last question